Okay. Hello, everybody. How are we doing tonight? Okay, I can't hear your answers. I hope you can hear me. Okay, I guess if you okay, I get some thumbs up from people. So I know some people can hear me. Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, so tonight's topic, right, is the name I gave it was Does Gilgul Neshamos, which has various translations in English, does it conflict with Judaism? Now, the title itself will have some people ready to tar and feather me because the Gilgul Neshamos, according to some people, is probably one of the most basic, important factors that Judaism has to talk about is Gilgul Neshamos. Uh, and how can I dare say that or suggest that it might conflict with Judaism? What is Gilgul Neshamos for our backgrounds? I can give you three English translations for it. To most of us, every one of those English translations is basically meaningless. Okay, we can call it metempsychosis. Okay, give me a hands up if you have any idea what metempsychosis is. Okay, I'm just getting some shakes from both my live audience here and from my computer audience. I have a few people telling me that they have no idea what metempsychosis is. Okay, how about transmigration? That help anybody better? Okay, some people gave a nod to transmigration. Okay, if we want to be more specific, we could say transmigration of souls. Okay, reincarnation is a term most people are familiar with, but reincarnation is not exactly Gilgul Neshamos. Gilgul Neshamos is a type of reincarnation, but not all reincarnations are Gilgul Neshamos. Now, I'm not going to get into that because that's not really our topic for the night. But the background is as follows. Gilgul Neshamos is a concept that shows up in the Sifrei Kabbalah. In a moment, we're going to go through the Sifrei Kabbalah that discuss it at length. But just to give background so we know what we're talking about, we've all heard of the concept of Gilgul Neshamos. We may have heard it under other names. As a matter of fact, the word Gilgul Neshamos itself shows up in Jewish literature hundreds of years after the concept shows up. It was called by something else before, and we're going to mention that also. But Gilgul Neshamos is the fact that a neshama goes from one body, and after the person dies, it goes to another body. Okay, in other words, there's more than one. We talk about one man, one vote. You know, like one person, one neshama. So this idea is that at the same time, obviously, this neshama can't be in more than one body. But the neshama that I have might have been in somebody else previously, somebody else's body previously. And it then decided to, not decided, but it's now in my body. That's what Gilgul Neshamos says. Now, to explain the background, okay, how could I dare say this? I happen to be, the suggestion to say that Gilgul Neshamos conflicts with Judaism, right, has very good sources. Okay, Rav Sadia Gaon says that the concept of Gilgul Neshamos, or whatever term we're going to use for this idea, started with idolatry. He says it very clearly. It was an idolatrous idea. It is foreign to Judaism, right? He says it disputes with the concept of Tchias HaMesim, which is one of the basic concepts of Judaism, that at one point people will come back to life. And Rav Sadia says the idea is that every neshama has one body, and at the time of Tchias HaMesim, whatever that is, okay, which is not our topic for tonight, okay, but whenever Tchias HaMesim happens, okay, that neshama will go back to the body that it held. In other words, the body has been buried, it will be reconstructed. Okay, that's not our department, that's Rebbe Shalom's department, how he's going to make his body come back to being a form again. And the neshama of that body will be reunited with that body. Okay, well, he says if you concept Gilgul Neshamos, says Rav Sadia Gaon, then you are conflicting with the idea of Tchias HaMesim. Okay, because Tchias HaMesim means that every guf is going to be reunited with its neshama. And if you take a neshama and it went through several different gufos is actually the word, of gufim, I think, and gufim, should be gufim, gufos is the plural of gufa. So it's gufim. Which neshama does the guf go back to at the time of Tchias HaMesim? He doesn't ask the question this way. He just says that the origin of the idea is idolatrous. He says it very clearly. It's from Avodah Zarah, and the idea, he says, was brought into play to Judaism. Number one, it was already very popular among non-Jewish faiths, and therefore people took it and they brought it into Judaism. He said they used it to answer certain basic questions, certain basic hashkafa questions that we have, which are not new questions. Okay, the questions are, as to the way Chazal worded, is why do you have a tzaddik haralo, Rasha v'tovlo? How can you have a tzaddik who has a difficult time in this world and a Rasha who has, right, an easy time in this world? Okay, how does that happen? So Rav Sadia said, well, Gilgul Neshamos, or he doesn't call it Gilgul Neshamos. It didn't have the name of Gilgul Neshamos yet in his day. But the idea that we're talking about, he said, was brought in to answer this question. And he says, you don't need it for answering the question, right? It's just unnecessary to answer the question. Okay, he says, because I can answer that question without any idea of Gilgul Neshamos. He says, Gilgul Neshamos is not a Jewish idea, says Rav Sadia. And therefore, it has no place in Judaism. And the idea of using it to answer the question of tzaddik haralo, well, basically, he doesn't say it fully, but I'm sure this is what he means. It's to say that, well, the person is having difficulties or sufferings from what they did in a previous life, right? In other words, this neshama was in a previous guf at some time, so it's going through a Gilgul. Okay, it had a previous life in which it did certain sins. Okay, which I can describe how Gilgul Neshamas, the idea of how Gilgul Neshamas works. I will describe that soon. But it now is being returned to this world, and the suffering it has is for things it did in a previous lifetime. So Rav Sadia says, I don't need that for this whole thing. I can manage very nicely in all my religious beliefs and believe in Tchias HaMesim, Schar V'Onish, reward and punishment. There's a resurrection of the dead. All these are basic Jewish beliefs. You must believe in reward and punishment. You must believe in the resurrection of the dead. You can have all of these ideas. They're all important, basic ideas that we have in Torah Hashkafa. And all you really need to understand is that we don't have all the information, all the answers, right? We don't know all of Hashem's ways. We do know that there's a thing called an Olam Haba, okay? And we have no idea how the person gets rewarded, or for that matter, punished, but rewarded in Olam Haba. And therefore, we can manage all of this without this. So that's Rav Sadia's basic approach. Now, Rav Sadia is not alone in this idea, okay? Rav Sadia, just for our understanding, Rav Sadia goes back to, a long, long time in Jewish history. Okay, Rav Sadia lived in the 10th century. Okay, so Rav Sadia is over a millennium ago. He was without any question the greatest gadol, not only in his generation, but probably in the generations both before him and after him by many generations. He was outstanding not only in his generation, but in generations around him. And we will talk a little bit about Rav Sadia as we go on. But so the Rav Sadia was, without any question, he was not the only one who felt this way. And just to give you an example, the Sefer Ikrim, who is considered a basic Sefer of Hashkafa, he writes the Sefer to disagree with the Rambam's Ikri Amuna. The Rambam has 13 Ikri Amuna. The Sefer Ikrim feels that there really are only 3, right? That the Torah is from Sinai, that there's reward and punishment, right? And that, one second, what did I miss? And there's prophecy. And there's prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Torah came through the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. And basically, those 3 headings carry most of the Rambam's 13 Ikri Amuna. It's just a question of defining them, okay? But there are disputes between the Rambam and the Sefer Ikrim, which is not our topic for tonight. There are disputes between the two of them. But the Sefer Ikrim also takes very strong issue with this concept of a neshama going from one body to another body. He feels it is not a Jewish idea. It is not part of the basic emunah of Yiddishkeit. So it's not a basic required belief. Sefer Ikrim is not the only one. There are other Rishonim from the school of philosophy who disagree with the concept, but these are 2 major Rishonim, or the societies before the Gaonim, that I can point out to you and show you black on white that they do not accept it and they consider it to be a conflict with Jewish belief. Now, so one second. We've all heard about Gilgul Neshamos. Every one of us has heard about Gilgul Neshamos. So, where did the other side of the picture come from? Okay, well, the Mikubalim, okay, or shall we say most Mikubalim, okay, certainly accept the concept of Gilgul Neshamos, okay. It doesn't show up in the jargon of Gilgul Neshamos until about the 1300s or 1400s. For example, the Ramban, who definitely holds with Gilgul Neshamos, we're going to talk about it himself, never uses the word. It doesn't show up in his terminology. But it's called by other terms, and I'll just share with you the most common two terms that they use it for, those who don't use the word Gilgul Neshamos. So just if we ever are reading these materials and we find the terms used, Sod Ho'ibur. Now, Sod Ho'ibur has two completely different meanings in Judaism. Sod Ho'ibur is usually used to mean the idea of knowing how much time you have to wait from one month until the next month in order to figure out when Rosh Chodesh is going to fall out. That's, and when Rosh Hashanah is going to fall out. And that's the way we usually use the term Sod Ho'ibur. But to a Makubal, the word Sod Ho'ibur is used to mean the concept called Gilgul Neshamos. So, for example, the Rekanati, usually referred to in yeshivish circles as the Rekanti. So, the Rekanti or the Rekanati uses the term Sod Ho'ibur. And when he uses the word Sod Ho'ibur, he is referring to what we call Gilgul Neshamos. Okay, there's no question. You'll see how his description of it. Rekanati was a big Makubal. So that's how he's used the term. It is occasionally referred to under the term ha'ataka. Now, ha'ataka in today's modern Hebrew means a photocopy. Okay, so obviously they didn't mean a photocopy, right? When they used it, it's hard to imagine that the Rishonim HaMekubalim were referring to photocopies when they used the word ha'ataka. Okay, now the word ha'ataka in original Chumash Hebrew. Okay, I'll just show you one place it shows up at Chumash. In Parshas Lech Lecha, it says, "Vayatek misham hahara." Avram Avinu took his following and he brought them up to the mountain. Now that's an unusual verb. Why do you use the word vayatek misham hahara? Okay, he brought them up to the mountains. Say, plenty of other words to say for it. He led them up to the mountains. He instructed them up the mountains. They encamped up in the mountains. They traveled to the mountains, right? It's the only place I can think of in Chumash where the word vayatek is used, right, as a verb in that sense. Okay, the same root means atik, means old, right? Atik yamin, in Aramaic more, and in Hebrew means something very anciently old. It's usually used to refer to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Okay, well, Rav Hirsch explains the root of the word ayin taf kuf, vayatek, right, means to take something away from the context that it usually would belong in, or to put it in a context that it fits in. It doesn't fit in this context. It belongs in a different context. And what Avram did when he said vayatek misham hahara was the realization that his people, in order to grow the way he wanted them to grow, in their Yiddishkeit, in their appreciation of God, in their godliness, right? They have to be taken away from the rest of civilization. Because civilization is so corrupt that it's going to cause them a huge amount of harm if they remain with wherever they are. So in his usage, vayatek, that pasuk uses vayatek means take them from here, right, and bring them elsewhere. Okay. And that was the original, the word atik, meaning very old, doesn't even belong in this world anymore. It's too old for our world. That's how the word atik means. The word ha'ataka here means you take the neshama from the one guf that was in, and now it becomes part of a different guf. That's how the origin of the word ha'ataka was used, right, in this context, okay? So we have the word ha'ataka, or the word sod ho'ibur, or the word Gilgul Neshamos. And there, as far as I'm aware, are three ways of describing the same idea, okay? The same idea in English, we have three words for it in English, three words in Hebrew, three words in English: reincarnation, or transmigration, or metempsychosis. But all of them mean that the neshama leaves one guf, and that neshama ends up in a different guf. Now, how old is this idea in the Sifrei Kabbalah? So if I mention to you Sifrei Kabbalah, what's the first Sefer Kabbalah that comes to mind? Okay, yes? The Zohar. Okay? I think the first thing we'll all say is when you think about a Sefer Kabbalah, the first thing that comes to mind is the Zohar. The Zohar talks about, does not use the word Gilgul Neshamos, but refers to this idea of Gilgul Neshamos, concept of Gilgul Neshamos, many places, and its most extensive places in Parshas Mishpatim. It has a huge piece in Parshas Mishpatim where it explains the whole idea. So the Zohar, without any question, works with the assumption that there is this concept called Gilgul Neshamos. Now, not as the Zohar use it, I would fairly say almost all Mekubalim consider it a very basic yesod. Of course, here we're going to have a fascinatingly interesting question. And I'm not going to go into this question too much in detail because I don't have enough information about it. And one of my rules of thumb is that I don't like to talk about things I don't know anything about. So if I'm forced into talking about something that I don't know anything about, I will try to be quiet. Okay? There's a parish on the Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Yetzirah is one of the earliest historical Sefer Kabbalah. According to the Messiah, Sefer Yetzirah was written by Adam HaRishon. Okay, now I'm not arguing the fact whether it was written by Adam HaRishon or not, but the Messiah we have on it is written by Adam HaRishon, and it's definitely a Sefer Kabbalah. Okay, you can read Sefer Yetzirah. I can get a copy for you very easily. I doubt you'll make any heads or tails out of it. You won't have any idea what it's talking about. Okay, we have the most detailed early parish on Sefer Yetzirah is traditionally credited to being written by Rav Sadia Gaon. So that creates a very interesting question. If this is the earliest of the Sefer Kabbalah, right? And the author of this Sefer Kabbalah, parish on the Sefer Kabbalah, is Rav Sadia Gaon, okay? So does it mean all the Kabbalah have to hold of this concept of Gilgul Neshamos or not? I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to say that there is some controversy. There are those who say that it's wrongly credited and that the Sefer Yetzirah was not written by Rav Sadia Gaon. But there's really, I have not seen those who decide why they feel it couldn't have been by Rav Sadia. I have a suspicion that their reasons for saying so is because they can't believe that Rav Sadia would have written the Sefer on Kabbalah and not accept Gilgul Neshamos at the same time. Okay, that's my suspicion. If that is true, what I suspect, then it's probably true that Rav Sadia did write the parish on Sefer Yetzirah. Okay, so we're going to hold on that question for right now. I'm just pointing out that indeed Rav Sadia may have been a tremendous Mekubal. He may have been, but just did not hold that this was a proper placing in Kabbalah. It means that he didn't hold of the Zohar. He didn't see the Zohar. That's quite obvious, right? He would have referred to it on some level if he'd seen the Zohar. The Zohar was hidden for 1,000 years, as far as we're aware. We don't know hidden to what extent. Did individuals know about it? Some individuals knew about it. There are places in the Zohar where the language is Spanish or Portuguese, which means that things were added to it, which we know that the Zohar has things that were added. Not everything in the Zohar is written by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. That's quite obvious. But there's plenty of people quoted who looked after Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. But whether the kernel part of the Zohar was written by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in Aramaic, and then later on things were added to it, and this is part of the kernel part, I have no idea. Okay? I'm just pointing out that in Sifrei Kabbalah, the concept of Gilgul Neshamos is a very, very, very basic idea. And Rav Sadia, the Sefer Ikrim, others do not hold of it. Now, this gets into a very interesting idea that I'm going to share. Sefer Eov, okay, in English, Job. Okay, well, if we want to deal with the question of Tzaddik V'Ralo and Rasha V'Tovlo, okay, we're not going to deal with it without an intense study of Sefer Eov. Obviously, that is what Eov is all about. Okay, Eov starts out with the fact that how wonderful a life he has to be in the Sefer, and then the Satan is out to get him, and everything falls apart on Eov's life. His children die, his wealth is lost, he becomes sick physically. Back and forth conversations between Satan and the Ribbono Shel Olam. Then his three friends come to visit him, and there's this very difficult communication between the friends and Eov. The obvious reading is that they're telling Eov that you must have sinned because this wouldn't have happened otherwise. And Eov is defending himself by saying, I know I have never sinned. Okay, that's a pretty bold statement. But that's the background between it. And then Elihu shows up on the scene. And Elihu comes and says that, no, you've missed it all. I've been following your conversations, you four old men, and I'm telling you, you missed the whole thing. And then Elihu comes on the scene and he tells them, what is Elihu telling them is not at all clear. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom shows up on the scene, and the very end of the story happens happy ever after. And we have the Gemara Baba Basra, where the Gemara says that we don't know if Eov ever lived. There's several shittas in the Gemara. Those who do say he lived, some say he lived in the time of Avraham Avinu, some say he lived in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, some say he lived much later, hundreds of years later. It's in the Gemara itself. Okay? Then in the Gemara itself, it says, it says he never lived at all. The whole thing was an invention. The whole story is an invention. And the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim brings this dispute. And he says that clearly from this Gemara, dispute in the Gemara, it's understood that much of Sefer Eov is meant to be just a marshal. Whether or not there was an individual could be the dispute, but that the major story is meant to teach us and not meant to be literal is quite clear that everybody said that, right? And certainly everybody holds that the conversations that take place between the Satan and Hashem, which is the whole beginning of the Sefer, right, is invented. That's meant to teach us a lesson. That's not part of, that's not part of what happened. That part of it is to give us background to appreciate it. The Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim as Dover, that's clearly what's going to be here. Now here's where it gets really fascinating. The two major Mefarshim on Sefer Eov, major early traditional Mefarshim on Sefer Eov are Rashi and the Ramban. Okay, now Rashi definitely knew about the Kabbalah. Rashi makes many allusions in his Perushim, both in Chumash and the Gemara, to ideas of Kabbalah. The Ramban was very heavily steeped in the Kabbalah. By the way, the Ramban, as far as I'm aware, never refers to the Kabbalah under the word Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah in the Gemara means Navi. When the Gemara says we know something midivrei Kabbalah, it means it was written in Navi. Okay? The Ramban usually refers to the words of Kabbalah as divrei ha'emes. Okay? That's how he usually refers to it. Al derech ha'emes. Okay? The words of truth. The manner of truth. The way of truth. Okay? The Ramban doesn't use the word Kabbalah. I don't know if he ever does. Okay? But the concept of what we call Kabbalistic or Kabbalah or Kubbalim, he doesn't use that. He calls it derech ha'emes. Okay? Now, the Ramban's parish in Eov, which is not easy to study, that's the first thing. But the Ramban's entire parish on Sefer Eov is to explain that what Elihu's message was, that you don't realize that your neshama was in a different guf. And because your neshama was in a different guf previously, that's why tsaris happened to you. That's how the Ramban is apparently explaining it. The Ramban is very, very terse, but remember that Sifrei Kabbalah writers always wrote in very, very brief and terse ways. And I'm just going to give you one or two examples so we'll have a better appreciation. The Ramban himself, when he writes things in Kabbalah, for example, in his parish on Chumash, okay, when the Ramban writes things in his parish on Chumash, he writes them very, very hints, very, very unclear exactly what he's getting at. It's not just the Ramban who does this in his style. There are other Mefarshim whose style is always this way. And as a matter of fact, it's understood that the Gemara itself was telling us that, because the Gemara talks about the Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava, and the Gemara says that you're not allowed to teach these things to somebody directly. You have to tell them in a hinting fashion, and they have to try to figure it out on their own, because if they don't, you're not allowed to teach it any other way. And I'll just give you an example. The Ravid, the one who wrote the Baal HaSagos, the main arguer of the Rambam. So the Ravid was the greatest Makubal in his generation and never wrote a word about Kabbalah. So how can I, Yirmiyahu Kaganov, tell you that the Ravid was the greatest Makubal of his generation when I've never studied a letter of Kabbalah from him? I never read something from him. Very, very simple. The Ravid had a son who was referred to as Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar. Sagi Nohar means he was blind. It's a euphemism for it. It means man of much light. That's how you write about people who are blind. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar was the Ravid's son. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar had a nephew who was the Ravid's grandson. So the Ravid had two sons. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar was one, and the other one had a son. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar in his generation was known to be the greatest Mekubal in his generation. Everybody who studied Kabbalah in Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar's generation who had access to him, means he lived in the Provence, so people went from Spain to the Provence to study Kabbalah from him. Okay, they went from other places to him to study Kabbalah. He was considered the greatest Mekubal in his generation. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar said that whatever he knew in Kabbalah was what his father had taught him. He said he had no other source to teach him Kabbalah. All his Kabbalah knowledge was what his father, the Ravid, had taught him. Okay? Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nohar's nephew, who was considered the greatest Mekubal in that era after his uncle passed on, said that all his knowledge in Kabbalah came from his grandfather and his uncle. That's where all his knowledge in Kabbalah came from. He had no other Rebbeim in Kabbalah. Okay? Well, if the next two generations' greatest Mekubalim, who everybody went to study Kabbalah, said that their source was the Ravid, right? Obviously, the Ravid was a tremendous Mekubal, but never wrote a letter. Not one thing we have from the Ravid about Kabbalah. The only place we have any type of allusion to this is so oblique that it can be interpreted many ways. In one place in his commentary on the Ana Chazaka, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Ravid writes, there was Ruach HaKodesh in our Medrash that day to explain something. We're talking about halacha learning, right? And he writes that Ruach HaKodesh came to us. Now, what did he mean? If you don't want to accept the Ravid was a big Mekubal, he would say he was just talking poetically. We came an idea that we didn't know where our source for it was, and we attributed to Ruach HaKodesh that we would think about an idea because we don't know where such an idea would come from. And there's an acceptable way to say that that's part of what's called Ruach HaKodesh. Or the Ravid was just, he just mentioned it in passing. So Mekubalim were noted for not writing down anything about Kabbalah and just learning it and passing it on to Masorah. That's what the Arizal was different, because the Arizal taught it more almost in a public forum. Okay, and that was one of the Arizal's unique contributions in the whole idea. I'll just share with you something that I find amusing. In the Tshuva Sefer, Avodas HaGershuni, Avodas HaGershuni was a major halachic authority in his generation. Now, I'm going to tell you from my observation, virtually everyone of great Torah scholar knowledge from about the year 1450 or 1500 for the next several hundred years, I have not met a great halachic authority either in Gemara learning or in halacha learning who also was not a tremendous Mekubal. Every one of them was a tremendous Mekubal. As a matter of fact, their schedule of life learning was basically you mastered Chumash, you mastered Tanakh, hopefully, mastered Mishnayos, you mastered Gemara, you mastered Halacha, you mastered Medrash, and then you mastered Kabbalah. So it was only a question of at what point you started to study Kabbalah. You became a master of Kabbalah. The funny story is with the Avodas HaGershuni. If you look in the Tshuva Avodas HaGershuni, there is a Tshuva published in the Sefer, which is the following. Someone asked him a question about a very, very difficult and deep Kabbalah answer. The Avodas HaGershuni wrote him back, you're not supposed to put these things in writing. I would never put them in writing, but I see that you really, really are bothered by the question enough that I'm going to have to put this in writing to you. But nobody else should ever see this, and after you read this, you should bury it. Okay, well, if anybody wants to read what he actually answers, and it's published in the Sefer Tshuvas Avodas HaGershuni. So we could smile or laugh at that. The 1600s. Okay. I just find, okay, of course, this was not supposed to be published, but I can show it to you on the Sefer. It's there. Okay. Okay, back to our topic. Okay, so all of this is background. Okay. The Ramban wrote a parish on Sefer Eov. Okay. The Ramban lived, right, in the 13th century. Okay. The Ramban, in his writings on Sefer Eov, uses heavily the ideal of Gilgul Neshamos to explain what Eov is what's happening, what's the whole purpose of the book of Eov. Rabbeinu Bachya, who was famous for his commentary on the Chumash and for what they call the Kisra Rabbeinu Bachya, and particularly the Kana Kemach, in one of his essays in Kana Kemach, he goes through the Ramban's commentary on Eov and explains line by line what the Ramban meant. I don't know if we would be able to understand what the Ramban meant. We know it's deep Kabbalah. I don't know if we'd understand what he means because he's so terse without reading the Kada Kemach's explanation of him. Rabbeinu Bachya was a disciple of the Ramban, like 2 generations later. Okay, and he explains what the Ramban meant in his commentary to Eov. But from that period on, now the interesting thing is that the psukim and the points in Eov that the Ramban explains in a Gilgul Neshamos approach, those psukim show up in Rav Saadia Gaon's essay. In Rav Saadia Gaon's work, we could call it his magnum opus, his Emunas Videos, which is his sefer on Jewish philosophy or on philosophy, where he says that belief in Gilgul Neshamos, whatever the term he uses for it there, but the sefer remember was written in Arabic, and what we read is either English translations or Hebrew translations, unless you read Arabic. If you read classic Arabic, you can read it in the original. But as far as I'm aware, most of what I've seen people do is all in translation. I don't even know if we have anymore today a full edition of the original Arabic. So check that out. I've read it in the English and in the Hebrew. He discusses the very same psukim that the Ramban, hundreds of years after him, quotes as the sources for explaining Gilgul Neshamos. And Rav Saadia writes, you don't have to explain this according to Gilgul Neshamos. I know somebody's going to do it or did it or whatever, but let me explain to you how you can explain this pasuk without Gilgul Neshamos. Okay? I'm just pointing out that what the Ramban rings down very tersely, and Rabbeinu Bachya wrote in greater amplification to explain what this is all about, right? This was not new ideas. These were ideas that had already gone through discussion in Jewish literature 400 years before them. Okay? Rav Saadia was familiar with both sides of the argument, and he came to explain, let me show you how the non-Gilgul Neshamos will explain Eov, and why conceptually you don't need Gilgul Neshamos to explain to quote the expression, why bad things happen to good people, right? I don't need that. I can explain that simply with understanding that the Rebbeinu Shalom is not telling us the whole story. We only get a very small glimpse of what he is telling us, okay? And the rest of it is, we'll figure it out. Now, I'm going to point out to you 2 of the greatest Jewish philosophers of the time of the Rishonim would be the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, or the Rambam in all his writings, and the Kuzri, the Yehuda Halevi. The Yehuda Halevi has many references to Kabbalah in it. He quotes the Sefer Yetzirah verbatim, if I'm not mistaken, in the Kuzri. He quotes the whole Sefer Yetzirah in the Kuzri at one point. He, no question, had access to some Sifrei Kabbalah. Neither the Kuzri nor the Rambam make any reference whatsoever to the idea of Gilgul Neshamos, right? Not in their discussion about Tchiyas HaMesim, not in their discussion about what our Ikri Amuna are, what the difference between Jewish belief and non-Jewish belief, right? All of which they talk about at different times, okay? Not one of them makes a reference to it. Neither of them has any reference. Now, does that mean that they didn't believe in Gilgul Neshamos, right? Or that for whatever reason they felt there was no need to discuss it, okay? I'll let you try to think that one out. I don't go and give answers to questions that I don't really have any foundation with which to discuss. I'm just pointing out that we know that several major before early Gaonim and Rishonim didn't hold of the Gilgul Neshamos. We know that others, right, don't mention it at all, which means that they can make a total presentation of Jewish belief without coming on to the idea of Gilgul Neshamos. That's for sure it means, right? Okay, it doesn't show that they denied it, but it doesn't mean that they felt it necessary, okay? On the other hand, we have the Zohar and the Ramban, and I think, and the Rakanti, and I'm fair to say probably every Makubal post-Ramban who uses Gilgul Neshamos as their basic explanation of Yiddishkeit. It works itself around. Now, there's different approaches with Gilgul Neshamos, which I'm not going to go into, whether it's only, but I just give you an example. And I'll tell you how this example works. If you believe in Gilgul Neshamos, it's easier to explain certain ideas, okay? And I'll show you how it becomes very easy to explain an example. Let us pick an example of a real Russia. Does anyone want to pick an example of a real Russia? How about Bugsy Siegel?
Okay. About Bilam?
Okay. Well, a Jewish Russia we'll start with. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. So I'm picking Bugsy Siegel. Okay. I'm going to pick him as my first example. I'm going to pick Bugsy. Okay. Good old Bugsy. Bugsy was a Jewish guy. You don't like Bugsy Siegel? We'll pick somebody else. Okay, Bugsy Siegel was a gangster. Okay. You don't like Bugsy Siegel? Let me pick Meyer Lansky. Okay. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel at one time were partners in crime, most definitely. Okay. Bugsy was sent by Meyer and some of the others to Vegas, in Nevada, to, among other things, take over the gambling dens, take over the brothels, many other such things. Meyer suspected that Bugsy was skimming much too much, more than he was entitled to by their arrangements, from the profits in these ventures. And what did Meyer do to Bugsy? He rubbed him out. Okay, he hired a hitman, and Bugsy was, did not go to bed that night. Okay? Now, Meyer Lansky was eventually indicted for, what do they indict most mafia people for? They either get caught for, they either get killed by other mafiosi, or they get indicted for tax evasion. Okay, most mafiosi went to jail for tax evasion. Okay, so Meyer Lansky eventually got indicted for tax evasion. Okay, Meyer Lansky never spent a day in jail. Okay, he was convicted of tax evasion, and he appealed it. Well, most of us don't remember Meyer Lansky's case because we're not old enough, but we do know about O.J. Simpson's, right? And we know enough to know that it's not very likely that he was not guilty of first-degree murder, right? And we know that he was acquitted, right? But was convicted of the civil case for wrongful death for killing the two of them. Okay, actually just killing his ex-wife. Okay, well, it's an interesting, we're not going to go into that, but he had what was called the dream team for defense. Okay, of course, Meyer Lansky could have any attorneys that money can buy because there was no limited resources, and he eventually kept appealing and appealing and appealing until he died in his own bed of a heart attack. Okay, after just, while the appeals were being exhausted. Okay, that's not our background. We're not here to learn about Meyer Lansky or Bugsy Siegel. But let's talk Meyer Lansky for a second. Meyer Lansky, the day of his heart attack, okay, goes to the Olam HaEmes. Okay, we have three people here in the room aside from myself, my physical group. They can speak up without it having to cut me off on the thing. Those of you who are out there can raise your thumbs, tell me what you feel, okay? Who here feels that because Meyer Lansky did do some mitzvahs in his lifetime, he gave some stuff up, he was a person who gave stuff up. Who feels that because of the tzedakah he gave, he goes to Olam Haba, to Mishkav, right, and awaits Tchias HaMesim? Anybody feel that way? I don't have anybody here. Nobody sees that he thinks he's entitled to it. Okay? Who here feels that he should go to Gehenna? For as a long time, okay? We've got a couple of thumbs up on that one. We definitely have a few people who are sending him to Gehenna. Okay? Now, Meyer has, let's say, some really good attorneys. They're called angels. And they come and say, how can you come and send this guy to Gehenna? Do you really, and I don't know Meyer Lansky's past, but there's been enough, unfortunately, enough Jewish gangsters that we'll find one of them who had a really, really difficult upbringing. Whatever it might be, his father beat him, and and he was thrown out of the house at 7 years old, and he had ended up on the street, and he had a lot of bad influences until, and all this was his background. And the truth is that he kept mitzvahs that he understood. He did some mitzvahs. Okay? And the whole problem, all these terrible things that he did, was because he had very, very poor education, very poor background, very poor experience in life. Is anybody prepared to say we're going to send him to Gan Eden now? Anybody for any Gan Eden takers? I have a couple of thumbs downs, but I don't have anybody thumbs ups. Anybody saying that maybe we shouldn't send him to Gehenna now because of his argument, the angels and the background, and anybody feel we shouldn't send him to Gehenna? Okay, some of my audience over here says no, don't send him to Gehenna. Okay, so folks, we're not going to send him to Gan Eden. We're not going to send him to Gehenna. So what are we going to do with him? Okay, so there's a Kabbalah Sefer called the Seder Hayom. He was a contemporary of, roughly speaking, Rav Yosef Karo, the Arizal, that huge Kabbalah generation in Tzfat in the 1500s. He wasn't in Tzfat, he was in Ein Zaytun, which is a different town in the Galil. He had a yeshiva there to teach Kabbalah in. And he also wrote a sefer called Seder Hayom, which is a sefer, it's a soft Kabbalah sefer in the sense that it's really about what to do every day. It's divisive. There's not much direct, heavy Kabbalah discussed in Seder Hayom. But Seder Hayom asks a question which people have questions today's generation all the time. Everybody's got this question. And the Seder Hayom asks it as follows. You have a very, very great tzaddik. And his wife is a very, very great tzaddikus. And they have a child who ends up being, to put it the way we would use the jargon in today's world, off the derech. We will say he goes way off the derech. And for argument's sake, we're going to say he ends up being a Bugsy Siegel or a Meyer Lansky or some other such person about whom we'll assume that Avram Avinu does not get a lot of nachas from that angle. Okay, I think that's fair to say that one, right? And the Seder Hayom says, how can such a thing happen? How can you have a great tzaddik and a great tzaddikus, and they have a child, right? And the child ends up way off the derech. Well, obviously the answer is that everybody has their own free choice, everybody has their own bechira. But the Seder Hayom, good Makubal that he is, uses the concept that we call Gilgul Neshamos to answer this question. Everybody take the next step? Okay, here's your Meyer Lansky. Okay, let's say that he really, really had a terrible upbringing. Okay, and he had a terrible upbringing. He ended up on the street. He ended up as a young kid doing some shoplifting, ending up in jail. Okay, was there learning from bank robbers. Okay, and then discovered that, I'm not going to rob the banks. I'll get somebody else to rob the banks for me. Right? Why should I risk myself? Right? And it all went downhill from there, but it says the Seder. Now, what happened in the Beis Din Shomam? They looked at it and says, Gan Eden, you don't deserve Gan Eden, folks. Gehenim, well, the Bezdin Shalmala feels that he's got some pretty good people arguing him that we're going to make sure that he don't go there, right? We've got really good angels as defense attorneys, and every mitzvah he does becomes a defense attorney for him. And they're putting up a hard fight. So what's the Bezdin Shalmala going to do? We can't send him to Gan Eden. We can't send him to Gehenim. Excuse my language. What in heaven's name are we going to do with this guy? Right? So what'd you say? Send him back again. Where? The second time around's got to be a really good test. If it's a really good test, what type of family does he have to be sent to? Go ahead, loud and clear. He's got to be the optimal families. Otherwise, right? We have to prove, right? Did he choose to live an evil life because that was his choice of Bechira, right? Or did he choose because he had bad influence? But if he had optimal influence, he wouldn't have ended up that way, right? The Seder Hayom says that his neshama comes back, is put into this optimal family of this great tzaddik and this great tzaddikah, right? Or as they say in the old country, tzikanis, okay? And they're going to raise him, okay? And now it's his free choice and their raising of him, okay? Does he pass his test or does he not pass his test, okay? If he passes his test, then chances are that he won't be the easiest kid to raise through cheder or yeshiva. He's going to have a lot of rough edges, okay? But eventually he's going to end up with his feet on the right place, okay? He may not end up being another Rosh Hashiva or another huge tzaddik, but he'll be a shomer mitzvahs, right? He'll be a person who understands what Torah is about, okay? But if it's completely his own bechira, where is he going to end up? He's, right? Now I've answered your question, says the Seder Hayom. Okay, now, this answer that the Seder Hayom gives based on the concept of Gilgul Neshamos, whatever term we want to use for it, I don't know how Rav Sadia could use that approach to answer this question. Think about it. Rav Sadia says every neshama has one guf has one neshama, right? One man, one vote, one guf, one neshama. No such thing. Right? How could you have, right, somebody who did this and had this whole argument, you can send it back and put them in a different neshama, different guf. It doesn't work in Rav Sadia's system, right? Rav Sadia may not be bothered by the question. He doesn't discuss it. It's not my point to try to answer every question on Rav Sadia. All I'm pointing out is that this Seder Hayom's approach, okay, which is a gorgeous approach, and I have shared this approach countless with people that I can think of, privately, publicly, in public forums, right? To explain, right, that this was the person's, he had free, right? This was the background, a very fine family, right? The parents are really fine people, know how to raise children, they've got a lot of good judgment, and they have a kid who's completely off the derech in every shape and form, okay? So Seder Hayom has your answer for you. You are given charge of a neshama that made bad decisions, okay? We had to take this neshama, put it into a different guf where those decisions aren't a problem anymore. Will he choose right or will he not choose right, okay? He may choose to do the right thing. He may choose to do not the right thing, right? It's not your fault. He has his own free choice. Everybody has their own free choice, right? Now, Rav Sadia would say that on his own, right? I don't need the Gilgul Neshamos. The child was raised in a very fine home. Doesn't mean he has to end up being correct. He could make all sorts of terrible decisions. You don't need the Sifrei Kabbalah to answer the case. I can answer it on my own. And that's simply, I'm just pointing out that this approach to this question, which is people find very comforting, right, works with the Seder Hayom or works with the Sefer Kabbalah, and it doesn't work with the Rav Sadias. Okay. I'm going to pull our story together now. Okay. We're at a point at which I don't like to run people over time. That's my general policy on things. I like to start on time and end on time. In the last hundreds and hundreds of years, Klal Yisrael has accepted the concept of Kabbalah and the concept of Gilgul Neshamos as part of our bloodstream. Okay, it's definitely what we would say is accepted to be part of our Yiddishkeit. For I would say the last 600-700 years, it's definitely part of our normative way of Yiddishkeit. No question about it. And it has advantages for certain things that we can explain with it that we can't explain with the other approach. The question comes the following. Someone tells me, I can accept all I've learned about Judaism and Ikri Amuna, but I cannot accept this thing called Gilgul Neshamos or transmigration or reincarnation. I just can't accept this idea. To me, it sounds really strange and really foreign, right? What do you tell them? Well, I can tell you what I've told them. So don't believe in it. It's not one of our essential beliefs, right? The Rambam doesn't count it as an essential belief, right? None of the believers in Ikri Amuna count it as an essential belief, right? Rav Saadia and the Sefer Ikrim and others hold it runs counter to our basic beliefs. So we can say, well, in that area, we're going to follow the others who say that we can fit it in and it's not a problem in believing in Tchiyas HaMeisim. But it's not an essential belief, right? It has a lot of comfort level, I tell people. I can talk to a lot of people. I've been at Shiva houses. I've been in my office. I've been in shiurim and things on why kids go off the derech. And I can give it, and it gives people something to grasp or to hold on to. If people feel it was all my fault, it's not your fault, right? Okay, and it gives them a lot of meaning. But is it an essential belief? No, doesn't have to be. So if someone tells you, I cannot accept the idea of Gilgul Neshamos, the answer is, you don't have to. There's nothing compelling you to accept that, okay? You'll be very fine to be on the right side of Torah Hashkafa with a lot of great Gedolei Yisrael and not have to accept it, okay? I probably, if I had to force myself bottom line to say which one do I accept, I'll probably tell you I accept Gilgul Neshamos because I'll go with the Masorah of the last 700 years that most Gedolei Yisrael have accepted it, right? And with the course of time, I'm willing to live with that and go with it and go with that approach. But it's not essential. It's not something you have to accept. It's not something you must believe in. And if you're bothered by a child who dies young or goes through a miserable medical experience and then doesn't make it, well, Gilgul Neshamos is an easy way to explain that, right? This was a great tzaddik who for some reason needed some type of something in this world to be able to be taught, to work things through, whatever it might be. If you hold like Rav Saadia, I have other answers for you, says Rav Saadia. He says, you would think that you understand how the Rebbeinu Shalom's schar v'onish works, right? You think you understand everything about how he runs his world, right? I'm telling you that he's smarter than you are. The line that they say is that the Jews at Kriyas Yamsuf, 600,000 Jews, 600,000 men over the age of 20, probably about 2 to 3 million Jews, crammed up, according to the Yamsuf is in front of them, the Egyptians are, military is chasing them. To the two sides are bands of wild animals. That's what the Medrash says. Doesn't say that in the pasuk. You're kind of stuck, we would say, between a rock and a hard place. This is a lot harder than being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Okay, this is a real challenge. Okay, those who were thinking, how is the Rebbeinu Shalom going to save us? According to the Medrash, they say, I haven't seen this Medrash, I've been told over there's a Medrash. If not, it's a Medrash, I don't know who says it. Each one of them had an idea what their Rebbeinu Shalom was going to do to save Klal Yisrael. And guess what? Not one of them thought about the Yam Suf splitting. Okay, they all had great ideas what their Muslims going to do, right? Whether it's monkeys flying from the sky and picking up all the Egyptian soldiers, I don't know what they thought about, whatever ideas they had as to what they were going to do, right, to save the Jewish people. Yeah, the Rebbe Hashem smarter than all of us put together by a lot, right? We don't need that. Okay. Our topic was, does Gilgul Neshamos, whatever title we want to give it, okay, conflict with Judaism? The answer is one of my parties here, my wife said it depends who you ask. Okay? Another way of saying it is, it's a machlokas. Right? According to Rav Sadia, the Sefer Hikrim, and others, maybe even the Kuzga and the Rambam, we don't know. Maybe it is a conflict. We know that from the time of the Zohar and the Ramban and the Kanadi and the Reda Bachya, and everybody past that time, right? Gilgul Neshamos is, what are you talking about? That's one of the basic hashkafas of Yiddishkeit, even if it's not something we have to accept. But it's something that lets us understand a lot of what's going on that we otherwise do not understand. Okay, we'll continue next week with a very different topic. Okay, we have 2 more sessions of this topic on this series. Then we're going to shift the series to Sunday evenings because people in the States have complained that the afternoons on Wednesdays aren't good for them. And I'm planning during the Bein Hazmanim period to give a series that'll be on Sundays, evenings here in Israel, afternoons in the States. Please send me an email if you have my email address. If not, ymkaganoff, Kaganoff @gmail.com. And Bli Neder, I'll make sure you get an invitation. Everybody have a wonderful, those of who are fasting tomorrow have an easy and meaningful fast. Those who are not fasting have a meaningful fast. Kol Tuv, take care.